Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the penultimate Saturday Scholar event of this year. Let me just remind you that the last Saturday Scholars will be next Saturday when we're playing Louisville, and it will be given by John Duffy, who is the O'Malley Director of the University Writing Programme and an Associate Professor in the Department of English, and he will be talking about Beyond Civility, addressing the crisis in American public discourse. I don't think the word crisis is in any way an inflated representation of what sometimes seems to happen at the moment. But I want today to welcome Matthew Wilkens, who's going to talk about what's all the fuss about digital humanities. Matt is an assistant professor in the Department of English. He's a rather unusual assistant professor. If I simply tell you the degrees he holds, you will get some sense of what makes him unusual. His first degree was a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from William & Mary, and he went on to take a master's degree in physical chemistry from University of California at Berkeley. 2 years after that, he completed an MA in English from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, having somehow seen the light and moved from the dark side, and then moved on to a PhD in literature from Duke. He came to Notre Dame in 2011, and we're very, very pleased to have him here. His work is on contemporary literary and cultural production, and particularly he's concerned with the development of the novel after World War II. He's just finished his first book called Revolution, The Event in Modern Fiction, which is concerned with, amongst other things, allegory, event, and encyclopedism in the 1950s and 60s. He's published widely on 20th century literatures in contemporary literature, in NLH, and in Post 45, among other major journals. But he's also been working extensively with the new techniques that I suppose we define as quantitative cultural analysis, or in another way, digital humanities. He's been mapping the literary landscape of the American 19th century and looking at patterns of allegorical writing across several centuries. And he serves as president of the Society of Digital Americanists, which I have to admit is a society that's new to me. But when in the rise of digital humanities, I was looking for somebody who could explain to me and to you quite what is going on in the area. There is nobody I could think of who could possibly be half as good as Matt Wilkens. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Peter, for that introduction, and thanks to you for coming out on a beautiful but freezing Saturday before a football game. I appreciate it. I'm going to tell you a little bit today about the digital humanities, what it is, why anyone would want to do it, and why, for as promising as it is, it remains relatively controversial within humanities work. Briefly put, so just not to keep you in suspense for too long, digital humanities is the application of data-intensive and computational methods to answer humanities questions in literary studies, in foreign languages, in theology, philosophy, history, art history, that sort of thing. But to understand why this is important and why you would want to do it, you need to know two things about the way in which humanities scholarship has evolved over the last few decades. So there have been some important changes in what we do, but I think fewer changes in how we do it. What we do, first and foremost, is stare into the transfixing eyes of William Shakespeare. But what we want to do with those transfixing eyes and with the texts has evolved a bit. So where in the past we'd have asked questions that amount to, it would be too simple to say, why is Shakespeare so great? But what should we glean from the texts about the greatness or distinctiveness of Shakespeare? In the last few decades, there's been something called that we describe under the blanket term the cultural turn, in which we've started to ask questions that involve what writers like Shakespeare or other of the great books can tell us about the culture in which they were produced. It doesn't mean that we've stopped reading Shakespeare, stopped caring very deeply about Shakespeare, but the questions have become much larger and much more culturally oriented. What hasn't changed so much is how we attempt to pose and to answer those questions. So where Aristotle said, go read Sophocles and you will know what great literature is, we now say, well, you probably still want to read Sophocles. You might also want to read Toni Morrison. And if you take seriously the idea that literature is a useful or indicative symptom of the culture that produced it, you might want to read Harry Potter too. It's probably not Shakespeare, it's not Sophocles, it's not even Toni Morrison. But on the other hand, something that millions and millions of people are reading might be something you want to know about and might have something to tell us about the culture in which it was produced. So that's fine, except for this. This is the output of new fiction in the United States over most of the 20th century. There's nothing particularly specific to the US. I happen to be an Americanist, so these are numbers that I have at hand. But starting around 2000 or so, there are an awful lot of new novels coming out every year. We're up pushing 100,000 new novels. When I have a good year, I'm on leave this year, I've been reading a lot. I've read a couple dozen new novels. I worry about whether or not that's an adequate number compared to the total number that are being put out. One other thing to notice here, though, is that even this baseline here, it's not exactly low. There are 5,000, 10,000 new novels being published across most of the 20th century. And in fact, even if you go further back than that, in the American 19th century, there were 100 new novels coming out every year. In Britain, there might have been 10 times that number in earlier periods. So this isn't a new problem. It's been centuries now, in fact, that it's been essentially impossible to keep up with the pace of literary production, which produces something like this. That dot that you can probably barely see is roughly the size of the canon that we actually treat. That's, say, 300, 400, 500 books. Big circles, everything else that's been written. We're talking about 1 to 200ths of 1% of everything that's ever been published. It's hard to claim two things. Even if we care really deeply just about the great books, you've got to wonder a little bit whether or not we've managed to pack all of the great stuff into that dot. Might there be things that we've missed in this larger field just because we've never been able to get to them? And if we care about things beyond just the great stuff, things that might be indicative of their cultural context, even without being all that great, we certainly know that they occupy a lot of this space. So how could we possibly fix that? On one hand, we might just declare defeat. We might turn back to just reading the great books as we've already identified them. But I worry about doing that. I worry about the long-term relevance of English and other humanities disciplines as knowledge-producing structures. It seems hard to go on just reading the same things forever and ever without paying any attention to that other 99.99% of everything that's ever been written. I think what we'd like to do instead is find ways to get some kind of information from that huge body of text. And one way to do that would be to treat those texts as the material for data analysis, for data mining, for some kind of quantitative analysis. That's what the core of the digital humanities are about. Why is that controversial? Well, a couple of reasons. There is a certain portion of humanities scholars who would like to relitigate the cultural turn, who don't think it was a good idea in the first place to turn away from the great books, who would like us to go back, and who see anything that enable more treatment of non-great books as a step in the wrong direction. Fortunately, there aren't that many people still holding on to that side of the argument. It happened 30 or 40 years ago. It's relatively well settled. But there are nevertheless quite a few people who have either a romantic or you might say anti-scientific set of concerns, who think that what's unique and special about the humanities is specifically that it doesn't involve numbers, it doesn't involve math, it doesn't involve measuring things, and who'd like to retain at the core of the humanities a sort of feeling for books, potentially a kind of spine-tingling appreciation for literary greatness. I understand where that comes from. I enjoy the tingle in my spine in cases of literary greatness, but I'm not sure that I'm willing to give up all but one part in 10,000 of everything that's ever been written to maintain that as the single core of humanities scholarship. Lastly, there's some, I think, legitimate fear of change. If we start adopting quantitative methods, I think there's little doubt that literary studies and other humanities disciplines are not going to look the same 20 or 30 or 50 years from now as they do right now. Look at other disciplines that have turned toward quantitative methods in economics and political science, in some of the sciences as well, in biology and chemistry. Those disciplines don't look like what they did 50 or 100 years ago. That seems fine to me. I think that methods evolve around a constant core of objects or concerns. But I'm not particularly worried about what it looks like to be an English professor being different a generation from now than it does at the moment. But if you're going to assess whether or not this seems like something that's of interest and ought to be happening, it would probably be helpful to have an example or two of how these things work. So I'm going to show you a little bit of my own work and then a few other projects that other people are doing that I think are really fascinating as well. And then there'll be time for Q&A. I should say, though, if there's anything that is utterly opaque or violent objections or anything that you'd like to know, I hope you'll feel free to ask questions as we go along as well. So, Peter mentioned that one of the things I've been doing is trying to map literary geographic attention in the 19th century. I'll tell you a little about that work. It may be surprising to you, in a way it was surprising to me, to find that we really don't know what kinds of places people were writing about in the fiction of the 19th century. You'd think this would be the sort of thing we would have a handle on. And indeed, we have a couple of theories with substantial geographic components, but we really don't know what the state of affairs is. So I've attempted to discover that, partly because the raw data will be interesting, partly because it will let us assess some of the standing theories about what was going on in 19th century American fiction. Also, because at a larger scale, it may help us understand how big events like the Civil War, impact literature. That's something we'd like to know, particularly after the cultural turn. And it may let us make some tentative steps towards something that's kind of the holy grail of literary cultural studies, which is what is the relationship between changes in cultural context and changes in literary output. So I've assembled a corpus, a body of texts. It has about 100 million words, 1,500 novels or so. It's most of the books that were published around the middle of the 19th century, and it spans the Civil War. From that, I've extracted all of the place names, matched them up with actual geographic data. This all done computationally. It's much too large a problem to imagine doing it by hand. And found this. These are city-level locations. So if a book referred to China or the United States, that's not reflected in this map. I'll show you that in a second. But everything at the city level and lower is here. A couple of things stand out to me about this anyway. There's obviously a huge concentration on the east coast of the United States. It's New York City is this enormous blob here. The blobs are scaled according to the number of references. There's also quite a bit of attention to the UK and to Western Europe, also to sites of sort of classical antiquity, to Italy, to Greece, and to the biblical Holy Lands here. Not a lot anywhere else, at least not at this specific level, not when you're talking about cities. So already that makes it, that's an important piece of evidence in settling one of the ongoing debates in 19th century American literary studies, which is was there substantial interchange or investment between North America and Central and South America? That's something called hemispheric American studies, and it has lately been posited that this was a really important part of shaping 19th century American fiction. On this data, it doesn't look like that was a major part of the story of the development of American fiction. It doesn't mean necessarily that the hemispheric approach is the wrong one to take. There's not strong support in this data anyway. On the other hand, quite a few scholars have suggested that really, if you want to understand what's going on in the US, you need to know more about Britain in the period. And you ought to be oriented that way and studying that interchange. That does seem to be very well supported. If we look nationally, or internationally, excuse me, and include country level mentions, you see a little bit broader dispersal. Don't be terribly misled, this is log scaled, so it's collapsed some of the difference between them. But there is substantial international dispersal. The main thing you notice is that when you find a 19th century American book about China, it's not really about China for the most part. It's about elsewhere. It's about something exotically far away. And so you see these very general references to China, to Africa, to Russia, but you don't see a whole lot of specificity, and that's why there weren't the city level mentions there. Overall, about just shy of 60% of all the locations mentioned in American fiction are in the US, and a little over 40% are elsewhere. And there's only one sort of general point I want to make about that. I can convince myself that I'm not at all surprised by that result. But I'm a little suspicious of my lack of surprise, because I think I could have convinced myself I wasn't surprised by any number between, let's say, 10 and 90%. One of the things that brings up is just how many things we really don't know about what historical literary production looks like. I mean, when you're not reading 99+% of the stuff, it's hard to claim you really know what's going on. So sometimes just having these numbers is an interesting result. If we wanted to focus more exclusively on the US and see whether or not something big happened after the Civil War, we might break the data down into before and after. So 1851 to 1860 here on top, 1861 to 1875 below. I'm going to spend the next couple of slides trying to figure out exactly how these two figures are different. But I imagine you're seeing big picture the same thing I'm seeing here, which is that they look an awful lot alike. And this is interesting. I swear it's interesting, the fact that they look essentially the same. So the Civil War is the periodizing event of American history and of American literary history. That is to say, the sort of breaking point. When we teach surveys of American literature, they're divided into pre and post Civil War. If ever there were an event that we think should have caused pretty significant changes in literary output, this should be it. And in fact, we have a pretty strongly held story about what was going on. That story goes like this. In the years before the Civil War, most American literature owed an enormous debt to the Puritan heritage of the Northeast and of New England. After the Civil War, after we could sort of take for granted the existence of the US, then we ought to have seen a flowering of literary regionalism. We no longer need to worry about, is the US a thing? Does it hang together? And could instead then be more interested in variation within unity. So the usual story goes, there was a huge rise in regionalist production in the 1870s. Doesn't quite look like that's happening here. And so it may be that even these important periodizing events lead to a much slower or more gradual shift. It may be that what's really important are the small shifts on top of a relatively stable baseline, or at least a much more slowly moving baseline. Another thing you'll notice about this is that if you were to guess where most people live, it probably kind of sort of looks like that in the period. And in fact, if we look at state level populations, this looks a bit like the map that you just saw. And if we were to plot one against another, the number of literary mentions as a function of the population by state, you see a relatively strong correlation between the two. That's not all that surprising, although again, I'm not sure I could have told you that before I had this data in hand. But what might be interesting to us then would be the outliers, the cases that were disproportionately represented or underrepresented relative to the number of people who lived there. This makes me sad, I'm sorry to say. Red is underrepresentation, blue is overrepresentation. Indiana is no longer, but was the single most boring state in the Union in the middle of the 19th century. Although before our friends from Evanston get too smug, Illinois was number 2, and then Ohio was number 3. Overrepresented art is an interesting sort of mishmash. We're going to want to try to get at this. So New York, by far the most populous state in the period, by a huge amount, is nevertheless overrepresented even relative to its gigantic population. California is overrepresented. That's probably not shocking, although you wonder why, Oregon isn't, Texas isn't, it's not, there's something about California. Virginia is overrepresented, no big cities there. Not sure what's going on, although I've got a story to tell you in a minute. So this is nice in its own right, but it doesn't give us any temporal resolution. This is just averaging across the whole data set that I've got, the whole generation or so of fiction here. What if we saw what changed across the Civil War? That would be this. So now red states are those that saw decreasing representation between 1850 and 1875. Blue states gained representation over that same period. So Minnesota and Maine are outliers. There just aren't that many people who live there. There happens to be one book about Minnesota or Maine, throws the data off. Don't need to pay much attention to them. Oregon's an interesting case. Before 1860, there are a handful of books about westward migration via the Oregon Trail. After 1860, that immigration is mostly done. Nobody writes about it anymore. So Oregon goes away in American fiction after 1860. Most interesting, though, is a pair of states, Texas and South Carolina. Anybody got a theory about that? About what happens and why those two? So you can imagine the story about South Carolina. South Carolina is 100% the Civil War. If you write about the Civil War, as you do quite a lot after 1860, you write about Charleston and you write about Fort Sumter. Those stand in for the opening of the war, and so there's a lot of attention that shifts to South Carolina. But why not Texas? Why does Texas drop off the map this way? Well, part of it is about population shift, so that there's a changing baseline. But the bigger piece is that if you're writing about war after 1860, 1861, you are not writing about the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. You're writing instead about the Civil War, of course. And so you're no longer writing about locations where the Mexican-American War was taking place. All of that attention has shifted to the South. And so while South Carolina stands out more than the others, there's increased representation in Virginia and Tennessee and South Carolina, and even though it's very pale here, a smaller amount across the whole of the South, as well as in Maryland there too. So part of the story there, and a thing that's easy to forget when we're just focusing on the really good stuff, the big important books, is that most books aren't big and important and durable. Most books are about things that just happen to be going on at the moment. They're topical, they're fleeting, they're not meant to be read 50 or 100 years in the future. Even the ones that are meant to be read 50 or 100 years in the future often aren't. It's hard to predict what's going to be big. But that makes it easy when we focus only on the really canonical stuff to lose sight of what's going on in a lot of sort of day-to-day fiction that we might like to know something about. Highly topical. Okay, a couple of other things just quickly that are going on here. Another big piece of this story, and a big piece that we haven't really theorized much at all and haven't done much research on, is urbanization. So the big demographic change that's happening in the US in the 19th century is people are moving to cities. In 1850, less than 10% of the US population lives in big cities, the 20 biggest cities. A lot of those cities aren't that big by modern standards, but nevertheless, they passed for big cities back then. By 1880, that number has come up closer to 13, 14%. If you take all urban areas, this is data from the census. The census is willing to consider some things that are not very big. Anything over 1,000 people is an urban area as far as the census is concerned. There you move from about 15% up to close to 30%. And this is happening just in 30 years. I mean, there's a huge move towards cities and founding new cities as well. Nevertheless, literature vastly outpaces that. So just the 20 most used US cities in this American corpus represent nearly 40% of all of the location mentions. So literature is much more urban and much more invested in urban locations than we usually think it is. And in fact, this works directly against the hypothesis about regionalism developing after the Civil War, which was said to be a story about local color, about small distinctive communities. We don't usually think about urbanization coming in until around the turn of the 20th century with the rise of naturalism and that sort of thing, the gritty sort of urban sister carry, that kind of stuff. But here, it really looks like that's happening much earlier than we usually appreciate. So that's an important piece of information if you want to understand what's going on in 19th century American fiction. That said, you might think then, and in fact it has been said, that literature should have a kind of predictive function. In other words, literature can identify social trends and get out in front of them. It's easier, after all, to write about something than it is to move an entire society toward that thing. Or in the case of geography, it's easier to write about a city than it is to pick up and move thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people there. So one might reasonably expect that if a city like Chicago, for instance, is growing really rapidly, as indeed it is, so many of you will probably know Chicago was formally founded in 1837, within a couple of generations was one of the largest cities in the world. So that's the red curve here, growing exponentially through the course of the 19th century. Compare that to New Orleans, one of the oldest cities in the US, a large and important city, the third or fourth largest city in the early part of the 19th century, growing actually pretty substantially. It only looks like it's not growing much here because Chicago is ridiculous. It about triples or quadruples in size between 1820 and 1900 here. But nevertheless, an established city not growing nearly as fast. Seems like Chicago would be the interesting and dynamic and rising one. And if literature works in this sort of predictive, forward-looking way, we might expect there to be much more attention paid to Chicago than there would be to New Orleans. We already know New Orleans. We know the deal with that. Unfortunately, that's not at all the case. So the blue dots here are number of uses or mentions of New Orleans in the data set. Red down here is Chicago. Those are all zeros. There are a couple of ones or twos. You start seeing a little bit in the late 1860s into the 1870s. So at the very tail end, by the time, so at that point, you're talking Chicago right about at this point on the graph. So once Chicago gets to be a substantial sized city, you start seeing it be at least a fraction of the attention paid to New Orleans. That's interesting to me. There doesn't seem to be strong support, at least in this one instance. I've looked at this for a few other cities. They tend to work in the same way. I'm just not showing it here. There doesn't seem to be this large predictive capacity. In fact, the best way to predict how much attention will be paid to a city is to look at what its population was 50 years earlier. Yeah, interesting. I don't know exactly what to make of this, except that it seems to point toward a kind of conservatism about the topics of literature. There's plenty of radical and explorational and experimental fiction, but the bulk of it just isn't that. The bulk of it writes about things we already know, experiences we already have. So that's the little bit about my own work on geography. A few more techniques that seem to me interesting and promising. One of those is topic models. So I mentioned at the outset that one of our big problems is that we just don't know anything about the huge majority of books that have ever been written. We can't get at that by just reading more. We remain as finite as we've ever been. Like I say, I've had a good year and it's been a couple dozen books. That's just not going to scale to 3 or 4 or 10 million books. I'm going to die way before I have anything interesting to say about the large body of fiction, which means that we just don't know what's in there. So one thing that we can do is use this technique, topic modeling, which identifies clusters of words that co-occur in statistically significant ways. So when you see a term like bicycle, you'll often see it in conjunction with rider or helmet or wheel, something like that. This technique will pick out those terms as a cluster that you can then track across time. It's in a way related to search, the kind of thing that you're used to doing, just looking for keywords, except when you look for keywords, you have to know what you're looking for up front. And you have problems about ambiguity. So you might find a word like rock, which is going to occur in geology papers and music reviews and metaphorical literature about religious associations with rock. This will differentiate those because obviously those words keep different company depending on the topic of the piece. So 2 things here just to show you some quick examples. On the left here is a topic model of a whole bunch of literary studies journals over the course of the 20th century. Let me blow that up for a minute. What it's showing you, although it's got to be very hard to read from back there, is the rise of the cultural turn and cultural studies. So this figure here is the topic, new cultural culture and theory. That rises right around, that's 1980, right there. History, historical, new and modern. Social, work, form, social, society, public, class. All of these taking off somewhere between 1960 and 1980. Again, a thing that we might have known, but it was an open question just how widespread this shift actually was and whether it was reflected in the full output of literary studies. Indeed, it appears to have been. There are a bunch of other similar terms, one of them about the law, one about economics, that sort of thing. A much different example then. This is a fascinating project on ship's logs in the 19th century, taking now not the words that would have been used to describe the journey, but just the latitude and longitude coordinates of the ships themselves. So I want to emphasize a huge data set with no real structure. These trips aren't labeled. You'll get possibly a list of the ports that would have been visited, but nothing about the routes that would have been taken and nothing about whether one route is different from another. But throw all those points into a topic model and you see patterns that co-occur. So trans-American shipping around around Cape Horn here, before the Panama Canal. US-British shipping very heavily traveled. And Pacific whaling off the west coast of South America. Again, emerging without any kind of metadata or any sort of structure about what we should have found. Really fascinating to differentiate the different kinds of trips just based on raw trip data without knowing anything about them. Again, finding structure in a huge collection of data that you didn't know anything about on the way in. So that's one, and topic models are really promising and getting a lot of attention these days. Again, as a way to figure out what you've got in this huge pile of data that you otherwise wouldn't know very much about. Another interesting one has to do with network analysis. So this is a comparative study of American, Japanese, and Chinese poetry in the first half of the 20th century. Now focused not on the content of that poetry. Translinguistic, interlinguistic studies based on language proper are always kind of tricky, but instead based on co-occurrence patterns in publication. So what you're seeing is something like the social network of poetry as it's revealed by who's publishing where and with whom. And what you see is that the US, which is the top 2 figures here, is a mess.
a happy mess, not particularly structured. There are any number of sort of major points here. That journal happens to be poetry, a handful of others, but quite a few sort of broker and bridge figures between them. In fact, one of the fascinating things that came out of this study is that it's the second tier poets that link one coterie to another. So if you're a first tier poet, if you're a big deal in modernist poetics, you tend to publish in one place. Anything you write, you can publish there. You've got a tight group of people around you who you talk to all the time, who you publish with all the time. But if you're just outside that top tier, not a bad poet, just someone who hasn't gotten that same level of prestige, you tend to publish wherever you can. And you publish between different journals and with different coteries. In fact, maybe one of the reasons that you aren't one of these top tier poets is because you're willing to move back and forth between coteries rather than being fully committed to any one of them. Unsurprisingly, this network structure gets even more complicated as you go forward in time. So this is 1916 to 1918, and this is 23 to 25, so even more diffuse. You knew that was going to happen. Sorry, spilled some water. Yeah, so when you spill a bunch of water on your computer, it does strange things. Just 1 second. What I was about to show you, in addition to the fact that the US social network structure of poetics gets substantially more complicated over the course of the early part of the 20th century, was that the situation is really interestingly different in China and in Japan. In Japan, you have an essentially bipolar structure. That is to say, there are two major coteries and far fewer. There we are. Sorry about that. Two major clusters and far fewer bridge figures between them. There's a little group of bridges sort of here, but not nearly as many as you see out here. In China, the coteries are almost completely segregated one from another. So that helps to explain a number of things about sort of the formal variability of American poetics in the period and the much more firmly established set of forms that constitute modernism in China in the period. Last thing. We can also do text classification. What you're seeing here are two different examples of that process. One that categorizes text by their point of view. This is another thing that we don't really know, although we think we might. When did the third person point of view become the dominant form in the novel? That, on this evidence, looks like it's right about 1800. Squares relatively well with the story that we think we already knew. But again, we've never been able to examine the number of texts involved here. What happens is you feed an algorithm a few examples of first person and third person texts, and then tell it to go find more that look like those on the basis of the words they use or the way the sentences are put together. Interesting correlate then. So men across the whole of the 18th and 19th century use the first person point of view substantially more often than women do. I suppose you might find that not altogether shocking. But what's much more interesting about this is that our usual story says the development or the prominence of the third person point of view is indicative of the full formation of the modern novel. When people started writing novels, and you shouldn't forget, the novel hasn't been around forever. The novel is an invention of the 18th century. When people first started writing novels, it wasn't clear what it meant to do that or what a novel should look like. And so there was quite a bit of fumbling around, false starts, interesting ideas often, before the novel form was codified around, to put too fine a point on it, free and direct discourse and third-person narrative in the early part of the 19th century. Women were doing that through the latter part of the 18th century in a way that men only started doing in the first half of the 19th century. So if you want to know what the novel looked like, the codified novel looked like in the early 19th century, what you need to do is go read novels by women written in the late 18th century, because they were already doing it. That's where that form came from. So that's one interesting case. Another one is what's called sentiment analysis. It's possible to feed a training set to an algorithm that says, this is a book that is essentially happy, or a section of a book that's essentially happy or positive or excited. Here's another section that is down or dull or depressed. This happens to be positive and negative sentiment in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. I want to emphasize that you don't need sentiment analysis to read Portrait of the Artist. You really just want to read Portrait of the Artist. You'll do much better than the algorithm will. But if you've got 1 million books, then you need a computational approach that can do this at scale. And so once again, what you're looking for are changes in the content of a large body of fiction over time. So that set of approaches, that's the last one of the ones that I want to show you, but that set of approaches to track attention, to summarize content, to detect network relationships and network structures, and to classify these sort of huge mounds of text are a range of approaches that are reshaping the way that literary studies works, and more broadly reshaping the way that humanities works, in order to do better the things that we already want to do. It's not that these techniques are driving the change in the questions that we're asking. That change happened. That change happened 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. But now we're finally getting the methods to catch up, to do better that kind of large-scale cultural analysis that just hasn't been possible until we could start doing this kind of work. So I'll leave it at that. I would love to entertain questions about any of this, angry denunciations, warm cheers for this change. But thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate
it. Matt, a real
Yeah.
basic question. The means, well, how do I start data mining? What are there? Is there software? Are there? Do you have to come up with algorithms yourself to do the research?
Yes.
What books are digitized? How much of the corpus is digitized to do this?
Yeah, right. So this is one of the trickiest parts. Let me take the last piece of that first, the corpus and the data availability. One of the most promising leads now is a project called HathiTrust. So many of you will know that Google digitized 10 to 15 million books a few years ago. They were, in fact, sued by the Authors and Publishers Guilds, but have now emerged victorious from that legal wrangling. A number of the partner libraries that Google worked with were foresighted enough to say, yes, you can scan our books, but once you've done it, you need to give us a copy. Those libraries now work together on something called the HathiTrust Digital Library. And they, with these copyright lawsuits now resolved, have begun to make available these digitized texts at a scale that has been previously just unheard of. Again, I think their access is now up to more than 12 million volumes. So that's the single biggest source. There's some downsides to that. So as you'll know if you've looked at a Google book scan, they're scans, and then they are converted automatically, algorithmically, to machine-readable text. That's an error-laden process. It will not produce something good enough to, say, study any individual book. On the other hand, it's in a lot of ways remarkably good. You'd be surprised how bad can be the quality of the scanned text that you can still understand. If you need pristine quality texts, there are a number of smaller projects, particularly for earlier periods, early English books online, 18th century collections online, that are smaller but have been hand-produced. On the question of getting started, though, with the techniques. So it's been a great dream of people working in the digital humanities that they're going to build a tool that will allow people with no previous experience with programming or data analysis to plug in some texts and get out interesting results. Probably the most advanced of those is something called Voyant tools. It's an interactive website. You can either use some of their pre-selected corpora, bodies of text, or supply your own, either with a link or an upload. And it'll show you relatively basic things, word counts, statistically improbable words, changes and trends over time. But the most sophisticated stuff, trying to do sentiment analysis, network analysis, text classification, even the geolocation extraction stuff that I showed, just isn't possible yet without knowing a fair amount of programming stuff. Our major contribution, I think, in the humanities is not likely to be improving the algorithms themselves. Very happily, text mining algorithms are a huge area of research in computer science proper and in industry. Google, after all, is at some level nothing but a huge natural language processing research facility. So most of the driving algorithmic advances come from the computer scientists. Our contribution then is to say, well, where should you be looking in order to find the things that are of interest to us? Sorry, that was a rather long-winded answer. Let me add only that for those people who are at Notre Dame, although this is true at lots of institutions, the library has recently founded Center for Digital Studies. They employ half a dozen or more people who are essentially digital humanities specialists who exist to help faculty with interesting research problems, but without the technical skills to do this work, do the work that they want to do. I think that arrangement makes a lot of sense. You're not going to send your whole humanities faculty out to get an undergrad computer science degree and then come back and do this kind of work. Instead, you bring them and their good ideas to people who have the technical knowledge, and you work together on the solutions. So that's been a big investment that Notre Dame's made in recent years, and I think is really promising.
To go back to your geolocation slide, it occurred to me that social class might be a factor in that people have the time and education to generate fiction. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think that's almost certainly true. One piece of the research that's still in process and that I didn't present here involves trying to figure out as much as we can about the authors of the texts that are represented in that corpus. It's true, they are disproportionately wealthy, disproportionately well-educated, and disproportionately urban themselves. It would be nice if we were able to extract in a computational way more of that information directly from the texts. What does a text authored by a well-educated person look like compared to someone who isn't? Unfortunately, that proves to be very hard to do. Even very well-educated authors often write, take Mark Twain or something like that, take on a dialect. But I think you're absolutely right that there are important sort of self-selection and authorial effects, and that is yet another area of ongoing research. Absolutely true, and probably does drive some of the urban orientation. Another piece that we'd really like to know is who was reading these books, and that's much harder data to come by. There are not a lot of bestseller lists from the 19th century. What you do is you end up going back to publishers' records, the papers of these long defunct publishers where you can find them and see how many copies they were ordering to be printed. Because of course you could reweight those maps according to now not whatever occurred once in each book, but instead according to how many copies of that book were sold. Would certainly be an interesting thing to do as well. But again, hard data to come by.
What do you see as the next steps in digital humanities? Is it more study, or is it using this data perhaps for some predictive purposes?
I think that there are two really important areas that we're right on the cusp of approaching. One is moving these same techniques into the 20th century. So as Peter said when he introduced me, I am in fact a contemporarist and care very deeply about literature published after the Second World War, and yet I spent this whole talk telling you stuff about the 19th century. That's because until literally about 6 months ago, it wasn't possible to do this research on 20th century text because it had not been established that scanning and processing in copyright texts was not a violation of copyright. That now has been firmly established in a
court case that involved the Hathi Trust being sued by the Authors Guild. So that data is there. Hathi Trust holds it, Google holds it, and we're just about to be able to do things with it. So some of this is just an extension of these methods into a new historical period. I think the other piece that to me is really fascinating is to try and build, exactly as you suggested, predictive models of what kinds of social factors ought to be driving literary attention or literary content. So for instance, I touched on this in the story about urbanization. If people are moving to cities and moving to cities relatively rapidly, in what ways is that reflected in the distribution of literary attention? If the racial or ethnic composition of a nation or a state or a city is changing, how does that play out in the literature? As a country like the US becomes vastly more wealthy, how does that shape the kind of literature that's being written? We have stories about all of those, but in truth, we don't know if they're good stories. They're convincing stories. I mean, we believe them. But because they're built on such a small piece of the whole literary picture, we really don't know if they're broadly applicable. So one of the things you can do then is say, okay, build a statistical predictive model that says if you've got these economic and demographic factors in place, you should see this kind or these kinds of changes in the literature that's being written, and then see if that happened. See what other sorts of factors might be predictive in a way that you didn't expect. So I think that's the other big sort of frontier is statistical predictive modeling. Yeah.
As you mentioned Shakespeare in the beginning, can you use this to look at various authors and the kind of vocabulary they have? And it's argued that Shakespeare is high quality because he had not rich vocabulary.
Yeah.
I don't know if he had or if others had, but as a way of getting to what would be really quality literature, would you be able to do that?
Yes, you would. And in fact, a number of people have done that. You're absolutely right that Shakespeare does have a quite rich vocabulary. Unfortunately, that there doesn't seem to be a strong correlation between vocabulary richness and the quality of the work that contains that rich vocabulary. Shockingly to me, I certainly would have expected such a thing. But it turns out that authors of unquestioned quality, George Eliot, Jane Austen, George Orwell, even William Faulkner, do not have notably rich vocabularies compared to any number of genre authors in detective fiction or science fiction or something like that. It's shocking to me, and in truth, I don't really know how to explain it. But it appears not to be the case that vocabulary richness is a reliable indicator of literary quality. But it certainly is something that you can measure. One quick little addendum to that. Some of the most interesting early work in digital humanities was specifically on Shakespeare, in part, well, for two reasons. One, because anything you can say about Shakespeare is by definition interesting and important. Two, we understand Shakespeare pretty well. We've spent centuries reading and analyzing Shakespeare, and so it makes for a nice test case. If your computer predicts something about Shakespeare and it's wrong, the computer's probably wrong. Because a number of these techniques, I mean, if you set them loose on a bunch of literature that you don't know, and they tell you something strange, you've got to wonder whether there is indeed something strange in the literature, or whether the algorithm just isn't working right. So if you work with Shakespeare, you've got a nice case. So one sort of fascinating example, you can discriminate the tragedies from the histories from the comedies very reliably with computational methods. Except for Othello. Othello looks to every computer, to every algorithm that's been thrown at it like a comedy. So this is something that computers were not actually the first to detect this. As early as the 1970s, and I presume before, there were some suggestions that Othello has a kind of underlying comedic matrix. It's domestic. It's not about kings. It's not about history. It's not about the affairs of state.
It's about an affair, and it's about jealousy. And that usually is a characteristic of the comedies. The comedies are about everyday events, about family life and that sort of thing. And so even that sort of failure, the algorithmic assignment of the comedy label to Othello, is in a way a validation of the approach. It's picking out something that really is genuinely different about Othello.
Time for one more.
Yes.
Does anybody use these digital studies to write a best-selling novel?
Funny you should ask, not yet, but there's a group at one of the SUNY schools, Binghamton, I think, that has attempted to suss out the features that are highly correlated with best-selling literature. In the same way, there's also projects trying to decode the features that need to be in best-selling songs and movies as well. Unfortunately, in each of those cases, you can get pretty good predictive success if you have a book or a song or a movie and you can say, yes, it does or does not have these features. It's much harder, and they haven't yet succeeded in producing the song or the movie or the text in the first place. I wouldn't be shocked if we get there eventually. I really honestly wouldn't. And there's a big field of research in generative poetics, generative fiction, that is to say, writing algorithms that will produce fiction and poetry that is sometimes not awful. I think that's as far as one would want to go with it, but you know, that's progress.
Squeeze one.
Yes.
So back to your original premise, which was we have great books, and now we have this huge universe. So is our generation and the future generations condemned to getting the insights of society from 100,000 books instead of 1,000 now?
I don't think we're ever going to stop reading the great stuff. The great stuff's great for a reason. I mean, it's not only very enjoyable to read, but it's very informative to read too. One of the contributions I think that the work will make, in addition to characterizing the great mass of Drac, and it really is, most of it really is Drac, but that doesn't mean it isn't interesting in aggregate. But one of the things that this will allow us to do is to have a better sense of the ways in which the really good stuff stands out and is different. We think we know that, and we have good stories about how the really great books are distinctive. But we could make those stories even better if we also knew, in a more thoroughgoing way, what the bad stuff looked like. And that's been hard to do up to this point, just because, again, your days are short. You don't really want to spend that much of them reading the terrible stuff. But it would be nice to be able to make that contrast in even more effective and informed terms. So I think we are going to keep doing that too.
So the fuss is worth making, and Matt is leading the charge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.